What is justice? Welcome to Philosopher's Corner. I'm John. What is justice? Well, the standard definition of justice is a state of moral rightness, decency. So that means when it comes to moral assessment, the situation is right or correct, or the proper moral choice has been made, and it has placed an individual in a state of moral correctness. So, what does that mean overall? Because we're used to the term justice. Well, it means that most of our societal institutions have been set up to deal with the currency of justice. And its chief concern is justice. That meaning producing a state of moral correctness for the individual. Justice can only be applied to an individual. It is a customized state of being. And the moral rightness of that person's situation is tailored to that person, to that individual. And so the institution has a mandate and an obligation to provide that state to an individual. And in cases where a group requests justice or demands justice, the institution or the agency will treat the group as an individual, which of course immediately brings up problems that need to be solved. Now, in the sense of justice, there are many forms of it, but in the sense of it being requested by an individual, it means that there needs to be another party, be it an institution, an agency, another person, who is in a position to provide justice. Unless you want to get into the idea of God being an agency that can provide justice. But for philosophical discussions, we'll leave God out of it, and we'll discuss it as a human construct, primarily dispensed through human sociological organizations. Many times we call them institutions, and so we can just call them institutions from here on out. And their mandate is to provide justice as a currency and as a public job. Now, there are different forms of justice. There is corrective justice, which most of us are familiar with, which means that if I'm out in reality and someone wrongs me, then I take them to court. They've likely broken a law in the case, and I tell the institution what occurred and how they harmed me and how they deprived me of either, life, liberty, or material possessions to some degree. And then I'm requesting from the institution that they correct this state of affairs and put me back into a state of moral correctness, which is in relation to the state that I was in prior to being acted upon by another individual or group. So that's the idea of corrective justice. And in whatever capacity we believe the institution has to assess my previous state, and then in their capacity to attempt to put me back into a state similar to that prior to being victimized by the other party. And so that's a form of justice that we're pretty familiar with. There's another set of justice called distributive justice, where if these institutions have access to resources and they are in a position to distribute the resources, then there's a form of justice that dictates their distribution of the resources to individuals in a way that puts those individuals into a state of moral correctness or moral rightness. And the assessments that take place with that, obviously, are different than the assessments of corrective justice. Now, that's different than charity. It's different than other forms of distribution of goods. And the cases for distributive justice are far different than cases for charity. Although individuals who end up in a need for distribution of goods and resources can look very similar. And they actually can have arguments that say, well, I was essentially victimized by the institution in the first place, and now I'm attempting to receive justice from the institution that I say took me out of my state of moral correctness and put me into this bad state, or into a state where I don't have access to the opportunities that I should. And through this process of distributive justice, I'm requesting that you change my position in the matter because you have agency to do it. And once again, justice requires an individual or institution that has agency to change an individual's circumstances. Another part of justice is simply the recognition of the circumstances in which the individual finds themselves. In fact, that's the first phase of all of these systems of justice, of these abilities to distribute justice, which would seem to be one of the sociological benefits of having institutions. It's the recognition that justice is a state that exists, and it is a remedy which sociological units can distribute internally within their unit, within their system. So it requires an individual, and it requires a mechanism for distribution. Now, does it apply to non-humans? You know, to what degree does justice and placing things in a state of moral rightness apply outside of humans? Does it apply to all sentient beings? Does it apply to all systems outside of your institution's jurisdiction? Well, philosophically, yeah. I mean, any sentient being is entitled to exist in a state of moral correctness. So if humans are screwing up birds' lives to the point that they're going extinct, well, clearly birds deserve justice. Because in this case, humanity at large would be the institution and the agency for justice. And the birds would be the individuals who need to be put into a state of moral correctness or decency to level it out. Yeah, at least theoretically, philosophically. Now, back within the human system, and if we're in modern day, you know, we have this idea of social justice. And social justice appears to be an attempt to say that individuals in the current moment are being denied access to a state of moral correctness, which leads to access to current real-time opportunities for success, however you define that. But it's keeping them from, given that they're a person, an individual who has a certain level of skill sets and through all of the regular merit-based and evaluative processes, they're equal to another person who's in different conditions, but due to the way that the institutions have historically treated them based on superficial circumstances, be it color, gender, race, religion, creed, anything, or even like inheritances or economic heritages or any of those things. But in all other respects, they're the same person, the same individual, but the one individual is being kept from the ability to have equal access to the opportunities available because of the way institutions treated their historical line, and those institutions being the agents of justice, having the ability to not only do corrective justice but also distributive justice. Those institutions are actually, in this case, the individuals who had wronged the person in real time, but previous to their incarnation. And now people are addressing those institutions to say, you are in a position now to admit and recognize that you treated these individuals and their groups prior to this incorrectly. And you are in a position to provide both corrective justice and distributive justice. You can do things to put them into a state of moral correctness so that they can now, they're already level, but now the institutions, through the acts of justice and distribution of justice, can put a corrective lens on what's occurring and adjust for the harms that the institutions themselves did previously to level things out from the views of the institutions and the rules and access to the institutions within the sociological unit that the institutions are overseeing. And so many apparatuses have sprung up that agree with that and try to do corrective legislation, socializing, distribution of material opportunities, resources, monies, all sorts of things to try to achieve justice, which is putting the individual back into a state of moral correctness. And the moral correctness, of course, is interactive in this particular case. And the burden, it would seem, is on the institutions because the individual, without going into any sort of like spiritual realms or analysis, has no control over being born into the sociological unit that the institutions oversee, and they have no control over the particulars of their incarnation, be it race, creed, color, economic circumstance. It's random distribution as far as institutions are concerned. And so those institutions then, through their own mandate, through their own creation, their raison d'etre, the reason they exist, is to provide this currency and this stream of justice to individuals. And it's particularly important when the institutions themselves are historically at fault for not doing their job and having placed these individuals, remembering that groups can also be treated as individuals, into these states of moral unrightness. And when an institution places individuals in a immoral state, in a state of injustice, the behaviors that spring forth from being placed in a position of injustice, which can further exasperate, we'll say, immoral activity, the culpability for that does lie on the institutions for initially placing those people in immoral circumstances. It's unfair to the individual to say, well, if an institution that's job is to deliver justice and distribute justice has put you in an unjust position, oh, well, you're supposed to act like a saint, and you're supposed to overcome the immoral positions that the institutions who are supposed to be acting morally have placed you in. And so that's one of the ideas of social justice, is a recompense for institutions acting immorally and abusing and incorrectly using distributive justice and corrective justice. And so now it gets, obviously, this is philosophical, so that's the theoretical side of things. It certainly elicits a lot of emotions for people, because historical injustices emanating from institutions that their mandate and their job is to provide justice is particularly infuriating, as is all corruption. So justice, it's obviously a much deeper topic. There's a lot more that can be said. It's important to know that it is a real currency. It is a real power. Especially when we're discussing things philosophically, a lot of times it's difficult to make the intangible tangible, make the ethereal grounded, make the theoretical applicable. Justice is a prime example of making the intangible tangible. It's a theoretical thing. But it is where morality and ethics become tangible, is in the distribution of justice. In fact, we could say that justice is the primary currency of any public institution. It's the distribution of justice. It's the promise of justice. It's what puts any sort of authority into an institution, is their ability to assess and deliver justice. And it has many forms, and there are many avenues for it. And it might be one of the great uses of collective power, and it may be one of the great uses and synergies of sociological units in general. Because it doesn't matter if it's modern or ancient, it doesn't matter if it's industrialized or aboriginal sociological unit. Human beings, Homo sapiens, always organize around principles of justice, determinations about justice, and distributions of justice. That cuts across anything. Any time, any space, any land, any race, creed, color. Everybody comes up with different versions of it, but they're all remarkably similar. And they universally recognize the core tenets, which is that justice is a state of moral correctness, that it's real, and that it's for individuals. And it should be there and distributed by agencies and institutions. And it goes without saying that those agencies and institutions are only as healthy and strong as the actual justice and the proper delivery of justice and distribution of justice that they are providing to their populations. Well, I hope you found this helpful. Thanks for spending some time here at Philosopher's Corner. Have fun.